So tonight, I want to kind of both take a step forward and a step backwards a little bit. So we'll end up in the same spot-ish, maybe. So 2 weeks ago, this is the step back. 2 weeks ago, I talked about God goading Paul or Saul, right? The goad was the big long spear stick, and he said he held on to that line, right? I said that he held on to that line because I think sometimes that pastors hold on the lines because they think they're really going to preach well later. And so I said that Paul held on to that line, and he used it later on because he thought it might save his life. And so that was what I said 2 weeks ago, and that's kind of the step back. And today I want to step forward and kind of look at why did Paul's life need saving? What was going on that he needed saving from? That he would recall this story that happened 20 years ago and think, I need to tell this story. And so here's what was going on with Paul at the time. Paul was a bold man. We know that Paul was a bold man. They journeyed all over the place. And one of the places that Paul went to eventually was Jerusalem. And people kept telling him, you better not. Like, you better not go to Jerusalem. It's a really bad idea. How's that quesadilla? Good. Okay. Sorry, I was distracted by the deliciousness of Mexican food. That was funnier than you give me credit for. Anyway, so Paul, completely not focused. So Paul goes to Jerusalem, should not have gone to Jerusalem at all. People kept telling him, do not go to Jerusalem. It's going to be bad for you. And he said that he wasn't scared to go and do what God had called him to do. So he goes to Jerusalem. And one of the first things that happens to Paul when he gets to Jerusalem is he starts meeting with different groups. And remember, he's meeting with both groups of Gentiles. Gentiles are people he's trying to convert and help them become Christians. And then he's also meeting with groups of Jewish people too. People who were Jewish. They were the Hebrew people. They have come in. Most of them have now kind of accepted some of or parts of what Paul is teaching, but he's working on converting them as well because they're not sure that Jesus was the Messiah, that Christ figure. And so he's talking with all of them. And in the midst of all of those talks, some of the elders in the Hebrew culture get a little upset with Paul. And they get upset with him for kind of really what is a big thing. It wasn't true, but they got upset with him because they were scared that Paul had been taking Gentile people who weren't Jewish, into the holiest of holies. Which the holiest of holies was like, when you look at the Jewish temple, there was all these different levels. And eventually the holiest of holies was where the actual altar to God was. And the only person that could go in there was Jewish rabbis. Only they could go in there. And there's only a few people that were selected that they could be in that space. And so he, apparently to them, had been taking non-Hebrew people into that place, which was a huge offense, and they started getting really upset with him to the point that really it started getting kind of aggressive. And Roman guards jumped in to stop them because they were kind of scared for Paul. He really hadn't done anything wrong, but they were scared for him because all of this brouhaha was coming down on top of him. So he was kind of in trouble. So all of a sudden, Paul now finds himself imprisoned. And from chapters 22, this starts in 21, from chapters 22 to 26, Paul will stand trial 5 times. And every time that he stands trial, he does the same thing. He tells his story. He tells the story about the man who persecuted people of the way, tried to get rid of it, told the story about how God knocked him down, told him to follow him, and that he has been doing that ever since the past 20 years. So he continuously told that story, the story that God instilled in him, the story that God made happen with his life. He continued to tell that story over and over again. And over the next few years, as he's imprisoned, he'll be transferred around from time to time, and eventually he finds himself on a boat to Rome, which is interesting because Rome what we know about the world at the time, Rome was in a section that most scholars would say it was on the edge of what people would think was the earth at the time. They would think Rome is forever away, like literally the edge of the earth, okay? It was so far away. So literally, now Paul, not even by his own doing, is taking the gospel to the edge of the earth, which sounds an awful lot like what Jesus called us to do in the Great Commission, right? Go to all the nations, right, Dana? Go to all the nations, teaching and preaching, baptizing and teaching in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And so he's going and he's doing that. And so he's on the edge of the world nearly. He's on a boat. And he's been under persecution for quite some time. And eventually, he's on this boat and it comes under a storm. There's a storm that comes upon them, and they said for days they didn't know whether it was day or night, Luke writes. Like that's how bad this storm was. They didn't know what was going on, and eventually, when things had kind of slowed down a little bit, and this is in Acts 27, he says, for a long time, the storm had kind of calmed down. For a long time, no one had eaten. And then Paul stood up among them and he said, men, you should have complied with my instructions not to set sail from here. Then we would have avoided the damage and loss. Now I urge you to be encouraged. Not one of your lives will be lost. Though we will lose the ship, last night an angel from God, whom I belong and whom I worship, stood beside me. The angel said, don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar in Rome. Indeed, God has also graciously given you everyone sailing with you. Be encouraged. Have faith in God, and that will be done to you. So all of the people on this boat are terrified. Even though the storm has stopped, they're about to abandon the whole ship and be done with it, because they think that land is nearby. And Paul says, no, an angel from my God has come and said that I have to stand in front of Caesar in Rome. We're going to make it. We just have to stay faithful to what our mission was in the beginning. We just have to stay true to this story. And so Paul does, he encourages the men. He convinces them to stay on path, and that if they do, they'll surely make it to the other side. So some time had come by, and people still weren't completely convinced that Paul was right. And they were scared, and they were rationing food. And so no one was eating, and eventually it says that no one had eaten in close to 14 days. Just before daybreak, Paul urged everyone to eat. He said, this is the 14th day you have lived without food, and you've not even had a little bit to eat. I urge you to take some food, for your health depends on it. None of you will lose a single hair from your head. And then after he said these things, so he's encouraging them, take food, please, you need it to survive. I promise nothing is going to happen to you. He said, after I take these things, he took some bread, gave thanks to God in front of all of them, and then he broke it, and they began to eat. And all of the men ate and had their fill, which sounds kind of like two gospel stories. One, the loaves and fishes, right? They blessed food, and they ate in abundance, and all people had a full belly by the end. And two, it sounds an awful like the Last Supper that Christ had with his disciples. Now, what we know was this was not communion that Paul had with the people on the boat. For one, we know because most of the people on the boat would have been pagans, and Paul would have not done that with pagan people. But remember, Luke is writing this story, and Luke makes a point to say that Paul broke bread, blessed it, gave thanks to God for it, and then gave it out. He makes a point to draw a parallel with the communion meal that we celebrate. And he stays steadfast throughout all of that to knowing that God is with him. So this past week, this is my last story, and then we'll have fun. This past week, I got a call on Monday afternoon. I wasn't in my office, and so when I got back, I had a voicemail on my machine, and it was from an older member of our congregation who I know fairly well, but it was still kind of odd that he called and left a message on my machine. He said, "Adam, this is so-and-so, call me back." I was like, ooh. Like usually when messages like that happen, it's not a good thing. So I was a little bit scared for, like my life and my job mostly. And so I called him back and I said, "Hey, this is Adam. I just got your voicemail. What can I do for you?" And he said, "Are you up at the church?" I said, "Yes." He goes, "All right, I'll see you in a minute." Again, I'm pretty scared, okay? So he comes up to the church. I meet him outside and walk in. We sit out in my office and he says, "Adam, I got a 17-year-old grandson that's about to graduate from high school." And he said, "I want to write him a letter, and I have no idea what to do. Would you listen to this letter that I wrote him and tell me if it's good or not?" And so I was like, after I wiped my eyes off, I was like, "Sure, I'll listen." So he goes, he reads this letter. He's written it on a legal pad, and so he's just flipping through this legal pad as he's reading this letter that he wrote for his grandson. And he's like, "I want to show him that I'm proud of him. He's led a pretty good life. I don't want to bolster him up too much, but I want to encourage him a little bit." And so he writes a beautiful letter where he tells the story about the day that he found out that he was going to have a grandson and that he was born. And he goes through all of these things. But he said this one line that I wrote down, and it's kind of been in my head all week long as I've been thinking about Paul. He said, he told a story to his grandson about a day that life had gotten really rough for him. And he was in the hospital, and his father came to see him. And he said that this is what his father said when he came. He said, "Keep your head up, son, and your eyes wide open, and be prepared to climb the next mountain that's ahead of you." And I kept thinking about that, and I had him go back and I said, say that one thing about the eyes wide and the mountain again. So he told me again, and he told me a little bit more about that story. And I was so encouraged that was one of the things that he told his grandson. Because I think that's a lot of Paul's story too. Keep your head up, keep your eyes open, and be ready to climb the next mountain that's in front of us. And Paul did that continuously throughout his life. He kept focused. He stayed steadfast and faithful to the story that God had started in him from the beginning. And as we high schoolers, as we draw to a close in this year, it's my encouragement for you. That the faith that you have in this room, the faith that you have in this space is not meant to be set aside in this space. You don't come here and put it on and listen to us and worship and then set it aside and leave. You take it with you and you grow in it. And you stay steadfast and faithful to that story that God has begun in you. And as I thought about that more this afternoon, I decided that there's no better way to celebrate our time together, our faith together, and how it will be encouraged and continue even further than celebrating it with a meal that will save our life, a meal that sustains us, a meal that continues our growth in life. Just like Paul offered it to the people on the boat, he said that you have to eat this or things aren't going to go well. Now, we know that in communion that it's a means by which we receive God's grace. We're given grace. We are reminded of our salvation. And tonight, I'm going to open our table in a second, and I'm just going to invite you to come. And it be a step of remembering, A, what Christ did for you, but B, how much you need to sustain your faith to continue on that journey, on that walk faithfully as you leave this place. For some of you seniors, as you literally leave this place. For the rest of you, as we programming draws to a close for the summer and we go on trips. So on the last night before Jesus was arrested and the meal was drawing to a close, he took the bread and he broke it. Probably better than this. He said, "I love you so much that I will break my body and give everything I have for you. Take and eat this in remembrance of me." And then he took the cup when the meal was done. He said, as often as you meet, drink of this and remember what I've done to you, or done for you. He did stuff to us too, I guess, kind of. So here's what I want to do. Thomas and the band are going to come up and they're going to play. And I just want to leave the table open. If you want to come and take and remember about sustaining your faith, going from this place, remember what Christ has done for you, then come and take. You can grab a friend and come and serve to each other, or you can just come and take and eat. You can come 2 or 3 times if you want to. But come and remember what Christ has done for you. Let me pray for us. Gracious and loving God, we